Dr. Kael'theena adjusted her holographic visor, her four-fingered hands delicately manipulating a series of floating controls. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly under the light, and her elongated ears twitched in thought. She was deep in concentration, analyzing the cellular regeneration rate of the human male strapped onto the examination table. The subject, Commander Rylan Voss, lay motionless but conscious, his muscular frame secured by an array of translucent restraints. His chest rose and fell steadily, his dark eyes following her every movement with quiet intensity. "You could at least buy me dinner before strapping me down like this," Rylan drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Despite the situation, his voice carried a teasing warmth, a stark contrast to the cold sterility of their surroundings. Kael'theena glanced at him, her lips quirking in mild amusement. "Is humor a defense mechanism for your species, or are all humans this insufferable?" "Only the charming ones," he replied with a grin. She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued once again. Humans were endlessly fascinating, his physiological resilience, his heat patterns, even the way his heart rate accelerated when she stepped closer. It was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, though she suspected it wasn't entirely biological. "You're remarkably calm for someone being studied like a lab rat," she observed, her voice soft but tinged with professional detachment. She reached for a sleek, handheld scanner and moved it across his torso, her gaze flickering to the holographic readout. Rylan chuckled, the sound low and rich. "Trust me, this isn't the strangest situation I've been in. Besides, you don't seem like the type to dissect me, at least not without warning first." Kael'theena's lips twitched again, though she quickly masked the expression. She turned away, pretending to study the data displayed on a nearby console. "Your confidence is intriguing. It's not something I've encountered in other species." "Confidence? Or stupidity?" he quipped, smiling as her head jerked slightly, her version of a startled laugh. His gaze lingered on her slender form, the way her long, violet hair shimmered like liquid metal under the lab lights. There was a grace to her movements, a precision that hinted at both intelligence and control. She twisted her slender neck to face him again, her expression guarded but curious. "Your regenerative rate is far beyond what I anticipated," she murmured. "Your body adapts to stress and damage remarkably well. It's no wonder your species managed to survive first contact." "Good genes," Rylan said with a wink, earning an exasperated sigh from her. Kael'theena stepped closer, her gaze narrowing slightly as she examined him. "Your humor is a distraction," she said, her tone sharper now. "If you could refrain. And if you could stop pretending all this is purely scientific, maybe we'd make some progress," he interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time her steely composure faltered. What are you implying?" she stammered, momentarily thrown off balance. "I'm implying that you've been fascinated by me since the moment I stepped off that ship," Rylan said, his voice steady and laced with a teasing edge. "And I'm not just talking about the scientific kind of fascination." Kael'theena's cheeks flushed a deeper shade of blue, and she straightened, regaining her composure. "Your arrogance is astounding," she said, though her voice lacked the bite she intended. "Am I wrong?" he pressed, his gaze never wavering. She hesitated, her mind racing. It was true she had been captivated by him in ways she couldn't fully explain. His physical form was fascinating, yes, but there was something more. His humor, his resilience, the way he challenged her when no one else dared. It was maddening and exhilarating all at once. "You're my research subject," she said finally, her voice firm but quieter now. "Nothing more." "Then why are your hands shaking?" he asked, his voice softening as he nodded toward her trembling fingers. Kael'theena glanced down, startled to find he was right. She clenched her hands into fists, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the data she was analyzing. "I think we're done here," she said abruptly, turning away to deactivate the restraints. But before she could finish, Rylan moved. His hands shot out, gripping her wrists with surprising gentleness. The restraints had deactivated just enough to give him a fraction of freedom, and he used it to sit up, his bare chest mere inches from hers. "Kael'theena," he said softly, her name rolling off his tongue like a caress. The way he said it without hesitation, without the clipped tones most aliens used, made her heart stutter. "You're overstepping," she whispered, though she made no move to pull away. "Am I?" he murmured, his thumbs brushing against her wrists. His touch was warm, almost searing against her cool skin. "Or am I just doing what you've been too afraid to admit you want?" Her breath hitched, and for a moment the air between them was electric. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, the steady thrum of his pulse against her fingers. It was intoxicating. "This is unethical," she said weakly, her voice trembling as his gaze burned into hers. "Screw ethics," Rylan said, his voice low and rough. "Tell me what you want, Kael'theena." She swallowed hard, her resolve crumbling under the weight of his intensity, and then, finally, she let herself fall. Her lips crashed against his, the kiss desperate and unrestrained. Rylan groaned, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. Her body pressed against his, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel the connection that had been simmering between them since the moment they met. Kael'theena's cool skin sent shivers down Rylan's spine, while his heat seemed to ignite something deep within her. Their differences, both physical and cultural, only heightened the intensity of the moment. Her hands explored the hard planes of his chest, her fingers tracing the scars that marked his skin. He responded by trailing his lips along the curve of her neck, his breath hot against her sensitive skin. Every touch, every kiss was a revelation, a blending of their worlds in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was messy and imperfect and utterly consuming. For once, Kael'theena wasn't thinking about data or protocols or the consequences of their actions. All that mattered was the way he made her feel alive, unguarded, and entirely human in the best possible way. Kael'theena's lab felt suffocating now, its once sterile air charged with the energy of their forbidden kiss. She pulled away abruptly, her chest heaving and her usually steady hands trembling. Rylan's gaze lingered on her, his pupils dilated and his lips parted, as if he was about to speak. But the words stalled between them, unspoken. "I shouldn't have," she began, but Rylan cut her off with a quiet, almost reverent tone. "You don't have to explain." Kael, his voice was soft but firm, a steady anchor against the storm building within her. He shifted slightly, testing the loosened restraints on his wrists, but made no move to free himself completely. It was a gesture that struck her, a subtle acknowledgement of trust. She turned away from him, brushing her violet hair over her shoulder in a rare display of nerves. "This was a mistake," she muttered. Her voice lacked conviction, even to her own ears. "Funny," Rylan said, reclining back against the examination table. "Didn't feel like one to me." Kael'theena shot him a sharp look, but the effect was undermined by the flush of deeper blue spreading across her cheeks. "You don't understand the implications. My position. My people." "Let me guess," Rylan interjected, propping himself up on one elbow. "Cold, calculated scientist breaks all her rules for the reckless human? Sounds like the start of a great interstellar scandal." Her lips twitched despite herself. "You're insufferable. And yet you're still here." That simple truth hung between them, undeniable. Kael'theena wrapped her arms around herself as if to shield against the emotions swirling within. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Humans were her research subjects, fascinating anomalies to be studied and catalogued, not this. "Your people wouldn't approve?" Rylan pressed, his tone softening. "Let me guess they value logic, discipline, and keeping everything neatly in its place. Emotions are messy, they complicate things." Kael'theena stiffened. "You speak as though you know my kind." "I don't need to," he replied with a shrug. "I've seen it before. Cultures that put order over everything else. But you're different." His gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't." Her breath caught in her throat. He was right, though she'd never admit it. She had always been different, even among her own people. It was why she had chosen to study alien species in the first place, to seek out the chaos and unpredictability her society shunned. And now here she was, standing on the edge of an irreversible decision. Before she could respond, an alert chimed from the console behind her. The sound was sharp, jarring, and it yanked her back to reality. Kael'theena turned quickly, her fingers flying over the holographic controls as she scanned the incoming data. "What is it?" Rylan asked, his tone shifting to something more serious. She frowned, her elongated ears twitching as she read the report. "Anomalous energy signatures. They're originating from the outer hull of the station." "Let me guess, unexpected visitors." Rylan swung his legs over the side of the table, yanking at the restraints until they gave way with a faint hiss. He stood, his imposing frame towering over her, as he reached for his discarded shirt. Kael'theena shot him a glare. "You shouldn't have done that. Those locks were too easy to break?" Yeah, I noticed, he said, cutting her off with a smirk. Now, are you going to tell me what's going on, or should I just sit back and watch the fireworks? She ignored his sarcasm, her focus narrowing on the energy readings. It's not a ship, she muttered, more to herself than to him. The signatures are too erratic. It's something else. Rylan stepped closer, peering over her shoulder at the data, his brow furrowed. That doesn't look like tech, it's organic. Kael'theena's fingers froze over the controls. He was right. The energy patterns weren't consistent with any known technology. They pulsed and shifted like something alive. Her pulse quickened as the implications sank in. We need to investigate, she said, straightening. If this is a new life form. It could also be a threat, Rylan interrupted, his voice grim. You're not going out there alone. Kael'theena turned to face him, her expression hardening. This is my station. My research. I don't need a bodyguard. Maybe not, he said, crossing his arms. But you've got one anyway. Before she could argue, the station shuddered violently, nearly throwing them off their feet. The lights flickered, and a low, guttural hum reverberated through the walls. Rylan steadied her with a firm grip on her arm, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. Yeah, definitely not staying in here, he muttered. Kael'theena grabbed a sleek, handheld device from the console and clipped it to her belt. Fine, she said, her tone clipped. But stay out of my way. Rylan smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. They moved quickly through the station's labyrinthine corridors, the hum growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if responding to the energy. Kael'theena's mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. When they reached the airlock leading to the outer hull, Kael'theena hesitated. She placed a hand on the control panel but didn't activate it. Rylan noticed and raised an eyebrow. Second thoughts. She shook her head, though her body language betrayed her. This isn't how I usually conduct research. He leaned against the wall, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to the tension in her frame. First time for everything, Doc. Kael'theena glared at him but pressed the button to open the airlock. The doors hissed apart, revealing the vast expanse of the station's exterior. The stars stretched endlessly beyond, but her focus was immediately drawn to the source of the anomaly. A massive, pulsating structure clung to the hull like a living organism. Its surface glowed faintly, shifting through hues of blue and green. Tendrils of energy snake outward, anchoring it to the station. What the hell is that? Rylan muttered, stepping closer. Kael'theena scanned the structure with her device, her brow furrowing. It's not entirely organic. There are traces of synthetic compounds. It's some kind of hybrid. Great, Rylan said dryly. Alien leeches. As they approached, one of the tendrils twitched and began to slither toward them. Rylan shoved Kael'theena behind him, drawing a compact plasma blade from a hidden compartment in his belt. Stay back, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. The tendril lashed out, quick as lightning. Rylan moved just as fast, slicing through it with a precision born of experience. The severed piece writhed on the ground before dissolving into a pool of iridescent liquid. Kael'theena stared at the remains, her scientific curiosity warring with her survival instincts. Fascinating, she murmured, stepping closer to examine it. Fascinating isn't the word I'd use, Rylan said, his gaze fixed on the structure. More tendrils were beginning to stir, their movements agitated and deliberate. Before Kael'theena could respond, a deep, resonant sound echoed from the organism, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. It wasn't just noise, it was communication. Kael'theena's eyes widened. It's intelligent. Rylan tightened his grip on his blade. Let's hope it's also friendly. But the tendrils surged toward them, leaving no doubt about its intentions. Rylan stepped forward, his blade flashing as he intercepted the first wave. Kael'theena scrambled to analyze the creature, her mind working at lightning speed to find a solution. Rylan, she shouted over the chaos. We need to. Less talking, more running, he barked, cutting her off as he dodged another attack. Kael'theena hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together they retreated, the organism's relentless pursuit driving them back into the station. The doors sealed behind them, but the hum of the creature's energy remained, a constant reminder of the threat outside. What now? Doc, Rylan asked, his chest heaving as he leaned against the wall. Kael'theena's hands clenched into fists. Now she said, her voice steady despite the fear swirling within her, we figure out how to communicate with it. And we hope it doesn't kill us before we do. The silence in the sealed corridor was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the station's systems and the distant, almost rhythmic pulsing sound coming from the alien organism outside. Kael'theena leaned against the wall, her usually precise mind racing in chaotic loops. Rylan's heavy breathing filled the air as he paced a short distance away, his plasma blade still lit and casting flickering shadows on the metallic walls. We can't outrun it, Kael'theena muttered, half to herself. Her hand moved instinctively to the device on her belt, scrolling through the data she'd managed to collect during their brief encounter. And attacking it outright will only provoke it further. Glad you're catching on, Rylan replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm as he sheathed the blade at his hip. Because I don't think slicing at those things all day is going to solve the problem. Kael'theena shot him a glare, but her irritation was more at herself than him. It's not just a mindless creature, she said, her tone sharpening. It's exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with territorial defense. It sees this station as a threat or prey. Prey. Great, Rylan muttered. He stopped pacing and leaned against the opposite wall, his dark eyes fixed on her. So what's the plan, Doc? Talk to it? Send it a fruit basket? Because I'm all ears. Kael'theena ignored his sarcasm and began pacing herself, her long fingers tapping against her wrist device. If we can establish a means of communication, we might be able to convince it to disengage. But that requires determining the primary frequency it's using to transmit signals. Its energy patterns are erratic, almost like it's pissed off, Rylan offered. Her ears twitched in irritation, but she sighed. In simpler terms, yes. Good. Then let's stop it from being pissed off before it decides to tear this place apart, he gestured toward the sealed airlock door. Because whatever that thing is doing out there, I'd bet my last credit it's not just hanging around for a friendly chat. Kael'theena looked at him, her expression serious. This isn't a simple fix. If I'm right, the organism is responding to the station's energy output. The fusion core is likely agitating it. Agitating it how? Think of it like noise pollution, she explained, her tone growing more animated as she pieced the puzzle together. The energy signature of the fusion core might be disrupting its natural state. It's reacting defensively because it perceives the disruption as an attack. Rylan folded his arms across his chest, his brow furrowed. So what? We shut down the core and hope it calms down? Isn't that kind of risky? You know, for breathing and not getting sucked into the vacuum of space. Kael'theena hesitated. He wasn't wrong. Shutting down the fusion core would temporarily disable the station's life support systems, not to mention leave them vulnerable to external threats. But it might be their best chance at de-escalating the situation. It would have to be a controlled shutdown, she said cautiously, and only for a short duration, long enough to pacify the organism and establish communication. Great, Rylan said, pushing off the wall. Let's do it. Kael'theena blinked at him. Just like that. You're not going to argue. He smirked. I've learned that arguing with you doesn't usually get me anywhere. Plus, if you're wrong, I'll die being right about this being a terrible idea. Win-win. She rolled her eyes, but a small part of her appreciated his unwavering confidence in her even when masked by his constant sarcasm. It was oddly grounding. The control room was dimly lit, the air thick with the hum of machinery. Kael'theena moved with purpose, her fingers dancing over the holographic interface as she prepared the fusion core for a controlled shutdown. Rylan stood nearby, arms crossed as he kept one eye on the monitors and the other on the door, ever the soldier. Are you sure this won't blow us all to hell, he asked, his tone lighter than the weight of his question. Kael'theena didn't look up. The likelihood of catastrophic failure is minimal. That's not the same as zero. It's as close as you're going to get, she shot back, her concentration unbroken. Rylan chuckled under his breath. You know, for someone who's supposed to be all about logic and precision, you take a lot of big risks. Calculated risks, she corrected, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She glanced at him briefly. And you're still here, which means you're either as reckless as you accuse me of being, or you trust me more than you're willing to admit. Rylan's grin widened. Maybe both. Before she could respond, the console emitted a soft chime, signaling the core's readiness for shutdown. Kael'theena's expression grew serious as she turned to face him. Once I initiate the shutdown, we'll only have about 10 minutes of backup power before life support starts to fail, she said. If this doesn't work. It'll work, Rylan said firmly. And if it doesn't, I'll improvise. That's kind of my thing. Kael'theena hesitated for a heartbeat longer before nodding. She turned back to the console and pressed a series of commands. The hum of the fusion core began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch across the station. The pulsing sound from the alien organism intensified, echoing through the walls. Rylan tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his blade. Any second now, he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. Kael'theena focused on her wrist device, monitoring the organism's energy patterns. They were shifting, stabilizing but not entirely calming. It was as if the organism was waiting, watching. I need to send a signal, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She adjusted the settings on her device and began transmitting a series of modulated energy pulses. If I can mimic its frequency, it might interpret it as an attempt at communication. And if it doesn't, Rylan asked. She didn't answer. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The organism's movements outside the station became more erratic, its tendrils twitching and coiling as if in agitation. Rylan took a step closer to Kael'theena, his protective instincts kicking in. Kael, he said, his voice low. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. I'm trying, she snapped, her frustration bleeding through. This isn't exactly a precise science. Suddenly, the pulsing sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and both of them froze. Kael'theena stared at her device, her breath caught in her throat. It's responding, she whispered, her eyes wide. The organism emitted a low, resonant tone, almost like a song. It was deep and melodic, vibrating through the walls of the station. Kael'theena's fingers flew over her device as she adjusted the signal, matching the tone. Rylan watched her, his jaw tight. Is that good? It's not attacking, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and awe. I think it understands. The tone continued, growing more complex as it shifted through patterns and harmonies. Kael'theena's eyes lit up with wonder. It's beautiful, she murmured. Rylan raised an eyebrow. Beautiful wasn't the word I was thinking. Kael'theena shot him a look, but before she could respond, the organism's tone shifted again, this time rising in pitch. Her device began to vibrate in her hand, and her expression darkened. Something's wrong, she said, her voice tight. It's probing the station. Rylan straightened his hand on his blade. What does that mean? Before she could answer, the lights flickered, and the station shuddered violently. The organism's tendrils pressed against the hull, their energy surging through the structure. It's trying to interface with the core, Kael'theena said, her voice filled with urgency. It's not just defending itself, it's trying to assimilate the station. Rylan's eyes narrowed. Not on my watch, he drew his blade and turned toward the door. Get the core back online, Doc. I'll buy you time. Rylan, wait, Kael'theena called, but he was already moving, his determination unmistakable. She clenched her fists, torn between her instincts to stop him and the reality of their situation. With a deep breath, she turned back to the console and began the process of reactivating the core. Rylan moved through the corridors with purpose, the weight of his plasma blade a comforting presence at his side. The station trembled around him as the organism's energy seeped deeper into its systems. I really hope you know what you're doing, Kael, he muttered under his breath. As he approached the outer airlock, the tendrils began to pierce through the walls, their glowing forms pulsating with alien energy. Rylan tightened his grip on his blade, his jaw set. All right, you overgrown jellyfish, he growled, activating the weapon. Let's dance. The airlock hissed as Rylan stepped into the buffer zone, his plasma blade humming faintly in his hand. Outside the reinforced viewport, the organism's tendrils coiled and pulsed, their luminescent energy casting eerie patterns across the walls. The station's groaning framework underscored the urgency of the situation, each vibration a reminder of how precarious their existence had become. Rylan, what are you doing? Kael'theena's voice crackled through the comlink in his ear, her tone sharp with frustration. Buying you time, he replied, his voice calm but firm. He tapped the door controls and the outer airlock began to cycle open. A rush of cold, stale air hit him as the pressurized chamber adjusted to the vacuum outside. "Don't be reckless," she warned, her voice tight. "I'm almost done recalibrating the core. If you engage it directly, you could." "I'll manage," Rylan cut in, stepping onto the outer hull. The artificial gravity field embedded in his boots anchored him firmly to the station's surface as he walked toward the pulsating mass of the alien organism. "Just keep working, Kael." The expanse of space spread out around him, an infinite void dotted with distant stars. But his focus remained on the creature. Up close, it was even more massive than he'd realized, its translucent form shifting and writhing like a living aurora. Energy crackled along its tendrils, creating a low-frequency hum that resonated in his chest. "All right, big guy," he muttered, gripping his blade tighter. "Let's see if we can have a little chat." The organism responded to his approach. Several tendrils uncoiled and snaked toward him, their movements deliberate and almost curious. Rylan held his ground, his pulse steady despite the primal fear clawing at the edges of his mind. "Rylan, it's reacting to you," Kael'theena's voice came through the comm again, this time tinged with awe. "The energy patterns are stabilizing, but they're focused. Whatever you're doing, it's drawing its attention." "Good," he said. "Means it's not trying to eat the station for the moment." One of the tendrils stopped mere inches from his chest, its surface shimmering with an almost hypnotic light. Rylan remained still, his instincts screaming at him to strike, but he resisted. Instead, he extended his free hand slowly, palm facing the tendril in a gesture of cautious openness. The tendril paused, its movements uncertain. Then, to his surprise, it made contact, brushing against his glove. A surge of warmth and energy coursed through him, not painful but deeply unsettling. He grimaced, but he didn't pull away. "Kael," he said through gritted teeth. "It's touching me." "I can see that," she replied, her voice tight with both fascination and concern. "The organism is emitting a low-level neural frequency. It's trying to establish a connection." "A connection?" "Like a handshake," Rylan asked, his tone laced with dry humor despite the situation. "More like a data exchange," Kael'theena corrected. "Be careful, Rylan. If its energy overwhelms your nervous system." "I'll be fine," he interrupted, though he wasn't entirely sure of that himself. The tendril's touch was growing warmer, its energy seeping through his suit and into his skin. Images flashed in his mind, fragmented, chaotic glimpses of something vast and ancient. He couldn't make sense of them, but they carried an overwhelming sense of purpose. "It's showing me something," he said, his voice distant. "I don't know what, but it feels important." Kael'theena's fingers flew over her console as she monitored the organism's energy output. "Rylan, if it's trying to communicate, this could be our chance to de-escalate. But you need to maintain focus. Don't let it overwhelm you." "Easier said than done," he muttered, his grip tightening on his blade. The tendril pulsed again, and the images in his mind sharpened. He saw bursts of light, swirling nebulae, and intricate patterns that seemed to represent some kind of language. A sensation of urgency pressed against his thoughts, as if the organism was trying to convey a warning. "It's..." Scared, Rylan realized aloud. "It's not attacking us, it's reacting to something else." Kael'theena's voice came through immediately. "What do you mean?" "There's something out here, Kael," he said, his voice grim. "Something it's running from. It latched onto the station because it sees us as a shield or a beacon." Kael'theena's blood ran cold. A beacon for what? Before Rylan could answer, the organism recoiled suddenly, its tendrils snapping back like a wounded animal. The energy around it flared, momentarily blinding him. He staggered, instinctively raising his blade, but the creature wasn't focused on him anymore. Its attention had shifted outward, toward the void. "Kael," he said, his voice urgent. "Something's coming." Inside the control room, Kael'theena's eyes widened as she registered the new energy signatures on her monitor. They were fast, organized, and distinctly mechanical. "Rylan, we've got incoming ships unidentified, heavily armed. They'll be in range in less than 2 minutes." "Fantastic," Rylan muttered, turning to face the stars. In the distance, faint glimmers of light grew brighter as the ships approached, their sleek, predatory forms cutting through the darkness. The organism writhed, its energy surging in response to the new threat. Tendrils lashed out toward the approaching ships, releasing arcs of bioelectric energy, The first volley struck one of the vessels, causing it to veer off course, but the others closed in, their weapon systems activating. Kael, get the core back online now, Rylan barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. I'm working on it, she snapped, her fingers flying over the controls. The fusion core hummed to life, its energy stabilizing the station's systems. Lights flickered back on, and the air grew warmer as life support resumed. Outside, the alien ships opened fire, their weapons unleashing bright streaks of plasma that streaked toward the organism. It retaliated with a ferocity that shook the station, its tendrils striking out like serpents. Rylan ducked as a stray bolt of energy crackled past him, the heat singing the edge of his suit. Rylan, get back inside, Kael'theena shouted through the comm. You'll be caught in the crossfire. Not an option, he yelled back, his focus fixed on the battle unfolding around him. The organism was holding its own, but it was clear it was outmatched. The alien ships were coordinated, their attacks precise and unrelenting. Rylan gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't take on the ships directly, not with the limited resources he had. But if he could create a distraction, buy the organism and the station some time. Kael, can you reroute excess power to the exterior defense grid, he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. Kael'theena hesitated. It's risky. The grid hasn't been tested under these conditions, it could overload. Do it, Rylan said firmly. We don't have a choice. She muttered something under her breath but complied, redirecting power from non-essential systems to the defense grid. The outer hull of the station began to shimmer with a faint, electric glow as the grid activated. Rylan moved quickly, positioning himself near one of the external power nodes. He adjusted the settings on his plasma blade, overcharging its energy output. All right, let's see if this works. He drove the blade into the power node, channeling its energy directly into the grid. The station's defenses flared, releasing a surge of electromagnetic energy that rippled outward. The approaching ships faltered, their systems momentarily disrupted. The organism seized the opportunity, its tendrils lashing out with renewed strength. It struck one of the ships directly, crippling it and sending it spiraling into the void. The remaining vessels regrouped, their movements more cautious now. Rylan? The grid is overloading, Kael'theena warned, her voice frantic. You need to get out of there. Not yet, he said through gritted teeth, holding the blade steady. The energy coursing through the grid was unstable, but it was buying them precious seconds. The alien ships began to retreat, their engines flaring as they broke off the attack. The organism's tendrils slowed, its energy dimming as the immediate threat subsided. Rylan released the power node and staggered back, his body aching from the strain. Rylan? Report, Kael'theena's voice was sharp, but beneath it was an undercurrent of worry. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the retreating ships. We're clear for now, he said, his voice weary. How's the station? Stable, she replied, relief evident in her tone. But we're not out of danger yet. The organism is still attached, and those ships could come back at any time. Then we better figure out how to make peace with our new friend, Rylan said, turning to face the pulsating creature. Because something tells me it's the only reason we're still alive.